Welcome to Twin Talk Politics. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Twin Talk Politics. And today we are so honored to be joined by MP Carr, who is a member of Parliament for Winnipeg South Centre. And we actually visited Winnipeg in February and really got to know how nice the weather was there in the winter months, but also how amazing the culture, the people, the landmarks, the history there really is. So I cannot emphasize this enough, but we are so excited to finally have the opportunity to talk to him about so many things that Jason and I are so passionate about. But first, how are you doing today, MP Carr?
I'm doing very well, thanks. And I think you just gave away, though, the part of the next question, which was who's who, right?
Oh, okay.
Oh no!
I'm gonna do a quick last-minute adjustment. So, as you probably know, our first question was originally going to be, who do you think is Jason and who do you think is Jerry? But of course, you know the answer to that now. So we're going to still switch it up, but still ask a 50-50 question. So, who do you think was born older, Jason or myself?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to go with Jason as the oldest.
Wow, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. If you need any tips in the future going forward of like who's who, just know that like I'm Jason, I'm the better looking one. So yeah, there we go. If you need any tips in the future, that's your tip.
Okay. Okay, perfect.
Yeah. All right. With that very important question out of the way, let's just jump straight into the interview. So sort of the first question we have for you is, we're just wondering maybe if you could quickly maybe introduce yourself, how you really got interested and engaged in politics in the first place, and if you're willing to share some of your passions that you love to do outside of politics.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Jason. And thank you to you and Jerry for inviting me onto the show and also for what you're doing here. I think it's really important, particularly from young people, to be engaged in what's happening across the country, to tell stories, to have positive, respectful, open dialogue with people that helps us learn more about one another and about the country we live in. So I really appreciate what you're doing here with the podcast. I was really lucky to grow up in a political family. My father, who was actually the member of parliament in Winnipeg South Centre before me, had been involved in provincial politics. When I was in the womb, I was knocking on doors and engaging with people when my father ran in the 1986 provincial election here in Manitoba. So I was really lucky that I had people in the community that my father knew, that I was introduced to, that I was able to listen to and watch and learn from and ask questions of. And that just kind of continued into my early adulthood and then of course into my adulthood, and it started at a very young age. So I think politics is in my blood and public service is something that's always been important to me. In terms of just a little bit of background of myself, I was born and raised in Winnipeg. I did a French immersion degree from kindergarten to grade 12, and I was really thankful to my parents for keeping me in French immersion because it created a lot of opportunities I wouldn't otherwise have had, and at the same time it allowed me to see the country and the world from a different perspective. I did a little bit of a stint at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia before moving on to get my degree in Canadian political science and Canadian history from Carleton. I did a little stint in Southern England at the University of Exeter during my time at Carleton. Wow. Through an exchange program, which was really cool. And yeah. I came back to Winnipeg and got my degree in education from the University of Winnipeg. I taught for a couple of years before moving on to a job back in Ottawa working for the Minister of Canadian Heritage. And then I came back to Winnipeg. I ended up getting into education once again, and I was the principal of a really cool school that we'll talk about a little bit later, called the Maples Met here in Winnipeg. And after my time in education for about 4 years there, I started an organization with my friend Rebecca Chartrand called Indigenous Strategy Alliance. And the reason for that was that as a white Jewish person from kind of a middle upper class neighborhood in urban Winnipeg, and her an Indigenous woman from a reserve community in Manitoba, we thought that that was really what reconciliation looked like, to be working together. So that was a really cool, brief, but really cool and important part of my career. And then ultimately, in June of 2023, was elected as the Member of Parliament for Winnipeg South Centre.
So the second question we have for you comes in two parts. So firstly, in your opinion, what do you think are the most pressing problems currently facing youth in Canada as a whole? And additionally, what do you consider to be the most paramount issues for youth in your own constituency of Winnipeg South Centre?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't think that the issues facing youth in Winnipeg South Centre would be much different from the issues that youth are facing in other parts of the country. Of course, every constituency is different. The demographics can change. Socioeconomics might not be the same. But I think broadly speaking, there are probably 3 or 4 priorities I would say from my experience I have heard are most important to young people. One would be mental health. I think that your generation is growing up at a time when there is far more openness, understanding, focus on mental health as being just as important as physical health, and that it's an important component of our livelihood. It's something that we have to talk about, we have to be attuned to. And I think that that's very positive. I think there are a lot of challenges in the world right now that young people are facing that are putting pressures on their mental health. One of the things, I don't know if you guys want to get into a little bit later, but I was just actually talking to a group of 15 to 20-year-olds right before I jumped on the podcast with you. And we talked a lot about social media. I think social media is creating a tremendous amount of pressure and contributing to some of the negativity and toxicity we're seeing that's impacting young people in particular. So focusing on mental health is very, very important to young people in my experience. If when we're talking about young people, we're talking about 18 to 30, and we're broadening that category, then I think you have to include affordability in that question. The thought of being able to afford a place to live, whether that's your own home or even just rent, depending on where you are in the country. There are some significant challenges right now, and we can talk about, what the solutions are and why we face some of those challenges. But I think that affordability is certainly top of mind for young people at the moment. And then the other, which I would say, interestingly, is one of those issues that is a top issue for youth, but also a top issue for everybody, is around the environment and climate change. I would say that increasingly when I knock on doors or I have conversations with constituents over the phone or in other settings, a focus on the environment and the well-being of the planet and our future is one of, if not the top priorities. And I think that it's encouraging that we have an intersection between the way that young people and older people in our society are thinking similarly about the same issue. Often we see a disconnect because at different times in our lives, we have different priorities and different focuses. The objective or the reason as to why we're thinking about the environment as a young person or as an older person may be different. For someone in their 80s or 90s or 70s, it might be worrying about the future for their grandchildren or their children. And for young people, it's worrying about the future for themselves. But nonetheless, it is focusing on the same idea. So to summarize that, I think sometimes we pigeonhole ourselves a little bit into thinking that the things that affect youth are very different from the things that affect other people. There's some truth to that, but I also think that by and large, what matters to young people or to older people often intersects. But mental health, affordability, the environment, and one I didn't mention, which we can talk about a little bit later, is education as well, and whether that's secondary education or post-secondary education.
Yeah, for sure. We actually kind of want to continue on that vein of education. Something you mentioned is very, very important. And we know it's something that you are super, super passionate about. We know earlier you mentioned that you were a teacher, a principal, and a head coach for a local football team for a number of years. And then we also just know that you're behind so many amazing initiatives, really helping youth education-wise, whether it be, as you said earlier, addressing the mental health challenges or supporting a national framework for school food program. So we're just really curious to hear from a very experienced educator like yourself. What do you think are some of the biggest problems or issues you've seen in the educational system or curriculum-wise? And in regards to those issues, how do you think we can really tackle some of those?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I will maybe start by speaking to the second part of your question a little bit, which is just about what can we do. I will absolutely lend my perspective, but it's important to note that on a lot of these things, unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, but the reality of our constitutional system is that the federal government really doesn't have much to do with the education
Yeah.
system. That's a little bit different when we're talking about First Nation kids, and it's a little bit different when we're talking about some involvement with post-secondary, but by and large, it's something that falls within provincial jurisdiction. In terms of the biggest challenges, it's interesting you raise this because, as I said a moment ago, I was just talking to a group of young people and I was telling them a little bit about a school that I was the principal of. And maybe I'll just take a quick moment to tell you about that school. It's a school called the MET school, M-E-T. And there's about 200 of these types of schools around the world, only 3 in Canada. All 3 of them are in Winnipeg. And
Wow.
what's interesting about the MET is that it's grades 9 to 12. There are only 15 students in a class. They stay with the same
Wow.
teacher for all 4 years.
Oh, wow.
On Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they're doing project-based work in school. And then on Tuesday and Thursday, they're actually going out into the community doing internships. And they're
Wow.
interning with people that are experts in their fields. And it's focusing on the things that are interested or of interest to them. So for example, let's say you wanted to be a lawyer, then we would connect you with a law firm. If you wanted to be a teacher, then you'd be connected to a school, and the list goes on. One of the students that I spoke to this morning asked me, Ben, do you think that the Met School is better than traditional school? And I said, it's not that it's better than traditional school in and of itself. It's that it's better for some students, for a certain type of student. So I think, Jerry, the answer to your question is that part of the challenge that exists in the education system, if we're talking about at the primary and particularly the secondary level, so elementary, junior high, high school, is there's not enough choice for students. There are so many different types of ways in which people learn, different interests that they have, families' expectations or students' own expectations of what they get out of their education is incredibly diverse. And I don't think that, generally speaking, our education system has caught up to the more progressive nature and the changing nature of the way people are wanting to engage with the world. So if I could summarize without getting into too much complexity about policy and education, the simplest way to put it would be we need to have more choice for young people. So far as post-secondary education is concerned and universities, I think that one of the challenges is, and it comes back a little bit to the secondary system, I don't think that universities, again, generally speaking, some are better than others in this regard, but I don't think that they're doing a good enough job of letting students in on the basis of something beyond a report card. Report cards are important, but they're also problematic for a number of reasons. And one of the things that we don't do very well in our system is account for growth. I'm going to tell you a very, very quick story, and hopefully I don't eat up too much time of the podcast. But when I was in when I was getting my education degree at the University of Winnipeg, I had a fantastic prof, a guy by the name of Kevin Lamoureux. And Kevin would tell us the story. He was a very good student. He would get 95s, A+ on everything. And he had a friend that would get really struggled in school, didn't come from the greatest background, didn't engage much. He would get, 30s, 40s if he was lucky. So one day the teacher assigns this a book and a report to be done on the book. And for whatever reason, Kevin's friend really enjoys the book, and he gets a little bit of help and he gets coached along and he ends up writing a report. So when the grades come back, Kevin ends up getting a 95 and his friend ends up getting a 65. So Kevin's growth, is this, if anything, very small, and his friend's growth is massive. But at the end of the day, Kevin still has the A+ and his friend still has the C-. the question, or the C, whatever the grading system would be.
Yeah.
So what's the moral of the story? The moral of the story, or the question that we should be asking, is where in our education system do we account for growth?
Wow.
How do we recognize the growth of the person who went from 40 to 65 without just getting caught up on the fact that it's 65? Now that's a minute microcosmic example, but I think it needs to be applied more broadly speaking. There are a lot of people who did not find success in high school for a variety of different reasons, who are still highly intelligent, highly skilled, can bring a lot to the table, who are not able to gain entry into post-secondary because their grades, which I think is not always a fair representation of who they are or of their intellectual ability, doesn't qualify them. So we could talk more about that, but I would say that those two issues at both the high school and at the university level are really top of mind for me when we're talking about changes.
Wow. That's so cool and interesting to see, like, other people also recognizing, to see students not just by their numbers, but also by seeing their growth and their own individual lessons that they take away from school. So that's really cool to hear. Moving on to another concern that so many Canadians have right now is the ongoing crisis facing Indigenous communities across the country, particularly the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. In fact, while Indigenous women only make up 4.3% of the population, they account for nearly 16% of all homicide victims. And we know this is an issue that's very close to your heart. As you mentioned earlier in the introduction, you served as a vice president of Indigenous Strategy Alliance before entering and becoming an MP, working really hard to support and sort of empower Indigenous people in Canada. And now being MP, you've done so much in terms of advancing Indigenous language legislation, or being one of the key members to really push September 30th as a national holiday, Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So first and foremost, we wanted to really thank you for that. But secondly, we know the epidemic of murdered Indigenous women has plagued all across Canada, also specifically within Manitoba. When we went there earlier this year, we're actually able to see a lot of the red flags and the red dresses along like lawns and posted around the community, and seeing really the support to fight this issue. So we are wondering, from your perspective, what do you see as the root cause of this issue, and what actions has the government taken or should take to really crack down and address some of them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm glad you're asking it. Again, I'll start with the second piece of that question. It's very, very challenging to address some of the complex issues that are facing communities, and I'll talk about my view of, I think, how we got there. But there are lots of important steps being taken. I mean, you're right, Manitoba is certainly the epicenter of truth and reconciliation for all sorts of reasons. We've got the largest per capita Indigenous population in the country. Unfortunately, a lot of the recent crime and victimization we've seen against Indigenous women and girls has happened here in our province. There are lots of different things that can be done. It's a broader conversation, I think, about social supports and economic supports and cultural shifts in the mindset of Canadians. An example of some more practical policy steps that can be taken would include things like the red dress alert, which we just partnered with the province of Manitoba on recently. And that's a system that will engage the public in making sure that people are aware of what's going on in the circumstance of a missing person from the community, and different steps that can be taken to make sure that we can work along with law enforcement and others to try to get people home safely. But the first part of your question, I think, is really important, and that's how do we get there? What are some of the things that led to this? And in order for us to understand that, we have to go back over 150 years in Canadian history. I don't think a lot of people understand the extent to which the laws and the systems that were put in place when Canada became a country served to disenfranchise and isolate, and in many instances actually kill Indigenous people. So when you think about things like you'll often hear somebody who maybe doesn't quite understand the history to the extent that I think is necessary to make sense of this all say something like, this would be a non-Indigenous person who might say, well, my grandma and grandpa came to to Canada, or my great-grandma and grandpa came to Canada from wherever in Europe, for example, with nothing but the clothes on their back, and they were able to make a lives for themselves. And why is it that, and they didn't get any support from the government? Why is it that we have to give support to Indigenous people? And that'll be an example of where I might say to somebody like that, well, could your grandma and grandpa vote? Well, yes, they could. Could they own property? Yes, they could. Could they get legal representation? Yes, they could. Could they themselves become legal representatives like lawyers? Yes, they could. Were they isolated to certain plots of land that they were promised and guaranteed, and to only not have those fulfilled? Well, no, they weren't. So you start asking those questions, and you can very quickly see that over time, one group is subject to a variety of different provisions and policies and laws that put them down, and the other wasn't. The most important, I think, that I neglected to mention in that list would be, were your mom and dad or your grandma and grandpa stolen from their communities and put into schools against their will by law? Obviously, I'm referring to residential schools. So it's 150 years plus worth of racist and oppressive policies on the parts of successive governments of Canada. And it takes a long time to turn that around. And progress is unfortunately slow. I think that our government has done a tremendous amount to move the needle forward on this, but I absolutely recognize that it is not enough, and that there is a lot more yet that needs to be done. So we could talk about this issue for a very long time, of course, but I think that to understand why we're seeing the type of violence and challenges and obstacles facing Indigenous communities in Canada today, we have to take it within the context of 150 plus years worth of policy.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. And really looking at the root causes of this issue through the landscape of history, and not only having like a very narrow and closed-minded mindset. So thank you for that. Moving on, another part of your job that we found super, super fascinating that I'm sure not a lot of people know about is when you actually got elected as an MP. And to be frank with you, even Jerry and I, we didn't know this before the interview because of how many amazing initiatives you've already supported, how much you've already done on the Hill, and all that good stuff. So we thought you've definitely been there for an extended and very long period of time. But throughout this process of preparing for this interview, we've just found out that you were recently elected last year in a by-election. So our question for you is, we're super obviously curious and so fascinated by this. So we're wondering maybe if you could share how and what that experience was like for you. Were there any challenges you faced during the election process or the adjustment period? And how did you sort of overcome that?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jason. It's a good question. So a by-election is caused, as you may know, or as your listeners may know, by some type of vacancy that's created as a result of a person who was a sitting member of Parliament no longer being there. So that usually happens in a couple of different ways. In this instance, it was my dad, as I mentioned, who passed away. So that created a vacancy. More often than not, though, it's somebody who resigns or says that they're going to move on to something else, and now we need to have an election. So a by-election is really interesting because it attracts far more national attention than your riding would typically get in a general election. We have 338 different ridings, soon to be 343 different ridings in Canada. You don't feel particularly special when there's a general election because you're just one of many, many hundred, and everybody is off campaigning and fighting their respective battles. But in a by-election, there's way more focus on you because you're the only election that's happening. Usually there's maybe one or two others. In my instance, there had been 4 that day. So one here, one in Quebec, and 2 in Ontario. So what's interesting is that piece that you're a little bit more in focus from the national perspective. The obstacles of a by-election, I don't think from a mechanics perspective, the mechanics of a campaign are too much different, other than the fact that in by-elections historically, voter turnout is very low. And the reason for that is that when there's a national campaign, people see it everywhere. It's in the
Yeah.
papers every day. It's in the news every day. When it's a by-election, people are not really tuned into the fact necessarily that there's even any type of election going on. So you have to work a little bit harder to get people engaged. And it's also when you're in government, so as a Liberal member of Parliament and with the Liberal Party being the party in power at the moment, it can be an opportunity for people to express, either for better or for worse, the way for you as a candidate, the way that they're feeling about the government without there being a consequence of a change. So if I were to lose my seat in that by-election or win that seat in the by-election, Justin Trudeau doesn't go anywhere. It stays the same. That's very different, of course, in a national election. So you have to kind of understand that there's a little bit more focus on different aspects of what's going on in the country because of that. And just generally speaking, it's all about connecting with people. You knock on doors, you call people back, you respond to your emails, you go to coffee parties, and you listen, and you try to get a sense of what's on people's minds and what matters to them. And that's ultimately what your job is as a candidate, and it's most certainly what your job is as a member of Parliament if you're fortunate enough to be elected.
Yeah, for sure. That was really, really cool. And for a second to last question before we ask a fun question at the end,
Sure.
kind of has a little bit more to do with the youth. So we know in recent years there's sadly been a slight decline in youth engagement, whether it be less young Canadians voting or less young Canadians just coming out and voicing their opinions on what is most important to them. So we just wanted to get your perspective in what do you think are the best ways for the youth to be engaged within the political sphere, and do you potentially think if we lower the voting age down to 16, it can help in this process?
Yeah, I'm not sure lowering the voting age changes anything if your objective is participation. What reason would we have to believe that if people 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 aren't voting, that someone at 16 or 17 is going to vote? I'm not sure that now we could talk about changing the voting age, lowering the voting age to achieve a different purpose. But if the purpose is simply about getting voter turnout up, I'm not necessarily convinced that that makes a difference. But in terms of young people being involved, I think there's a lot of different ways. I mean, you guys didn't tell me how old you are, and I'm not going to ask. But you know, I don't know if you're a voting age. I'm guessing you're a little bit under voting age.
Yeah.
And here you are engaged. You're talking to members of Parliament. You're talking to people in your community. You're asking questions. I would argue that in many ways, because you have initiated engagement in the political process, you probably have more influence than people who are of voting age but who decide not to vote, because these people are, for a variety of different reasons, choosing not to lend their voice to a really important discussion that happens in the country around election time. So podcasts are great. Calling your local member of Parliament or member of the Legislative Assembly, writing letters, signing petitions, going to walks or marches, whatever the cause may be that's important to you, doing so in a peaceful and respectful manner. Keeping engaged in the affairs of the country, reading news sources that are credible and reliable, reading multiple different news sources. All of those things I think are really, really important for young people to stay engaged. And I think that there's sometimes a belief on the part of young people that, and I understand where it comes from, but that, my voice doesn't matter and what I say can't make a difference. And people in Ottawa are really far away. And I think that you just have to put yourself out there. And you guys have clearly done that. And I think if you pick up the phone and you write an email or you write a letter, or you stop by an MP's office, you'll be pleasantly surprised at how accessible and engaging I think the vast majority of public officials are. So in order to make sure that young people's voices are heard and listened to, young people themselves have to be engaged. They have to put themselves out there and into situations where they are aware of what's happening and they can be involved. So there's lots of different ways to do that. I think a good school and good teachers and good friends and
Yeah.
classmates can really help with that process as well.
Okay.
And I'm always open to hearing the perspectives of young people. I think I'll end that question by this response to your question by saying, I used to say a lot as a teacher, and I think this is true as a politician, that I learned a lot more from my students than they learned from me. And I think that that's
Wow.
true of being an MP, that you learn a lot more from the people you represent than they're going to learn from you. And that's the way it should be. Your job is to listen, and that's really important.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that was actually really, really powerful that you learn more from the people that you're actually supposed to teach or supposed to represent is really, really cool and very, very inspiring. So for the last and final fun question, we just found something that was so cool was that your amazing initiative of the Winnipeg South Centre Pet of the Month, especially the most recent winner, an adorable hedgehog. So we were just wondering what kind of inspired you to start this initiative to begin with?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the first thing is I'm a huge animal lover. I've got 2 dogs and 3 cats, and when I retire one day, I'd love to have a little farm of some kind and spend my time with animals. I
Yeah.
think that animals bring a tremendous amount of joy to our lives, and in addition to that, there's just so much negativity and toxicity out there, particularly on social media. And I just thought, if every now and then, once a month, instead of posting about something serious or something related to a challenge, that we just have, a more fun and kind of easygoing way of celebrating things that are happening in our riding, and Pet of the Month was a way to do that. So.
Wow, yeah, that's so cool. Yeah, so if you guys haven't checked out Winnipeg South Centre's Pet of the Month, please go check it out. It's so cute, and it will really make your day a lot brighter. All right, I think that concludes our interview today. Again, Jay and I would like to extend such a big thank you to MP Carr and also his phenomenal team for this amazing opportunity, and specifically MP Carr for taking the time out of his very busy schedule to meet with us today. We truly appreciate it. For all the listeners at home, if you guys wish to see more interviews and more episodes like this, be sure to tune into future episodes in future weeks. Take care, everyone. I'll see you guys next time.